Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I still remember the look on Carl Bennett's face when he told me I was no longer aligned with the company's vision. He had this polished calm about him, like he'd rehearsed the line in the mirror a few times, maybe even practiced the right amount of fake empathy in his voice. Meanwhile, I was standing across from him, feeling like someone had yanked the floor out from under me. 23 years with the same company, and the guy I helped on board 5 years ago was now firing me like I was a line item on a spreadsheet he couldn't balance. It happened on a Tuesday morning, right after our third quarter projections meeting. The air in the office was thick with tension, but that wasn't unusual. Ever since Carl took over as CFO, it felt like the place was slowly morphing into a high-stakes game of musical chairs, and no one could tell when the music would stop. He called me into his office with that stupid half-smile of his, the kind that made you feel like you were being sold a bad insurance plan. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, the gradually dwindling responsibilities, the younger, hungrier analysts being invited to meetings I used to lead, the whispers in the break room that died down when I walked in. Hell, even the Streamline Initiative memo that came out last week with phrases like culture realignment and lean efficiency plastered all over it like someone had copy-pasted from a TED Talk PowerPoint. Carl leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers like he thought he was in a Netflix boardroom drama, and said, "Tom, first off, I want to acknowledge everything you've contributed. You've been a rock here, but we're going through some necessary changes. To stay competitive, we need to modernize, restructure some legacy roles. I hope you understand. It's not personal." Not personal. That's rich. Funny how every time someone wants to knife you in the back with a smile, they start with, "It's not personal." I let him ramble on for a minute. Something about respecting my legacy, offering a generous severance package, and the opportunity to consult externally if I wanted to stay involved in some capacity. It was the same polished corporate script they give every overpaid executive who's outlived his usefulness in the eyes of whatever Excel formula told them I was too expensive. Only I wasn't some bloated VP who coasted for a decade. I'd been working late nights since before Carl learned how to file his own reimbursement reports. He paused as if he expected me to grovel or protest or ask what I could do to stay. I just stared at him for a moment, then reached into my pocket, pulled out my badge, and laid it on his desk. It made a soft click when it landed. For a second, it was the only sound in the room. I turned to leave, and he added, "If it means anything, this wasn't easy." I stopped in the doorway, looked over my shoulder, and said, "You're right, Carl. It wasn't." Then I walked out. The HR rep, some poor 20-something who'd only been with us a few months, was waiting outside his office like she'd just seen a ghost. She tried to smile, then offered to escort me to collect my things, like I was some kind of security threat. I nodded, took the long walk back to my cubicle, and started clearing out 2 decades of my life with the company. Framed pictures of my kids when they were still in grade school, a few coffee mugs, including the one I gave Carl for Christmas the year he got promoted, stacks of manuals I'd written back before we had cloud documentation, still bound with plastic combs and dust on the covers. It was surreal. One minute, you're planning next month's board presentation, and the next, you're holding a cardboard box full of your professional life like a cliché in some direct-to-streaming corporate drama. I said a few awkward goodbyes, but most people avoided eye contact. That's what fear does to people in places like this. No one wants to be caught sympathizing with the guy who just got walked out. But here's the part Carl didn't know. Or maybe he forgot. Maybe in his rush to wipe my name from the payroll and update the org chart, he didn't think to double-check access permissions. I had built that financial infrastructure from the ground up, over years, patching together archaic systems with duct tape and sheer willpower. And in one of the older back-end folders, buried under 3 layers of archive files, there was a spreadsheet. Not just any spreadsheet. Exec Comp Master v Final, Final 2. Excels. That spreadsheet was my Frankenstein, my monument to years of CFOs trying to hide their creative accounting. It tracked every dollar of executive compensation, every bonus, every stock option and deferred payout, every shady consulting invoice funneled through shell vendors, and every per diem that got padded with hotel bar charges. It was supposed to be internal only, meant for auditing alignment, which was corporate speak for let's make sure no one outside this room ever sees this. I was the only one who actually understood the formulas. Everyone else just read the summary tabs and trusted the numbers. Carl's name had its own tab, and the numbers under it were not small. We're talking about reimbursements for conferences that didn't exist, honorariums to firms registered to his brother-in-law, and a few very suspect depreciation adjustments that looked more like creative laundering than legitimate finance. And guess what? When I checked my laptop that night, after I got home and cracked open a very stiff drink, I still had access. So, no, I didn't march back in and shout at anyone. I didn't post anything on social media or call a lawyer or even rant to my wife. I just sat there, staring at those cells, those quietly damning little cells filled with dates and dollar signs and references to line items that didn't belong. And for the first time since I walked out of that building, I smiled. What would you do if the boss who stabbed you in the back forgot to take the knife with him? I didn't start out bitter. That's the part people don't get when they hear stories like mine. They think you must have been cynical from the jump or that you always had one foot out the door. But I came in swinging, optimistic, green as a lawn in spring. I was the guy who stayed late without being asked, the guy who covered for people when their kids were sick, the guy who genuinely believed that loyalty and hard work would get you somewhere better than a slightly bigger cubicle and a pat on the back at the holiday party. And for a long time, I thought I was climbing a ladder. But you know what it turned out to be? A treadmill. And the damn thing was set to incline. Back when I started, long before Carl showed up in his overpriced loafers and startup lingo, the company had this family vibe. Not in the trust fall way, but in the real gritty way where people had each other's backs. You put in your time. You earned respect. There were rough patches, of course, like when they laid off 20% of the floor after that merger with Bellman Group. But even then, it felt like we were all in it together. We helped each other float. The work was intense, but there was camaraderie, shared jokes, inside references to printer jams and broken coffee machines. We got through it by leaning on each other. I remember when Carl was first brought in, fresh off some 2-year stint at a consulting firm that boasted about disrupting middle-market finance. Like that was supposed to mean anything to the rest of us who were just trying to keep the quarterly report straight. I had been told to show him the ropes. He was sharp, I'll give him that. Smart in a spreadsheet way. He could manipulate a pivot table in his sleep, and he was a master of saying absolutely nothing in the most confident tone you've ever heard. He had the charisma of a man who never had to worry about being held accountable, and it showed. Every meeting he led was like watching a TED Talk that had been through a blender with a LinkedIn post. We need to break silos, he'd say, or let's reimagine the fiscal narrative. The rest of us just sat there, blinking slowly, hoping someone else would ask what the hell that meant so we didn't have to. At first, I didn't see him as a threat. He was ambitious, but I figured he'd climb the ladder somewhere else. It wasn't until the second round of reorgs that I noticed how quickly he was consolidating power, pulling key people into his orbit, nudging out the ones who pushed back. Suddenly, the reports I used to prepare went through him first. He'd tweak them, then present them as his own. That's when it started. Those little betrayals that wear you down, not all at once, but inch by inch, like erosion. One week, I wasn't invited to a strategy meeting I used to lead. The next, I was asked to train a junior analyst just in case they needed to take over some of my responsibilities during peak cycles. I got emails with my own slides rebranded under Carl's name, and when I asked about it, he smiled and said, "It's all collaborative, Tom. We're all part of the same team." Sure we were. A team where he got the credit, and I picked up the slack. I can't tell you the exact day I stopped believing things would get better, but I can tell you what it felt like. It wasn't an explosion, it was a slow leak. I had come home, dropped my bag by the door, and just sit in the car for a few minutes before going inside. I stopped checking in on the younger guys I used to mentor, stopped volunteering for extra projects, smiled in meetings, nodded in the right places, but mentally I was already halfway out the door. Except I wasn't. Because when you've spent over 2 decades at a place, you don't just walk away without a damn good reason. You wait. You hope things turn. You convince yourself it's just a rough patch. Burnout isn't fire. It's the absence of it. Meanwhile, Carl kept rising. He started dropping phrases like legacy headcount and role redundancy into his updates to the board, which we all knew was code for cut the older, higher-paid staff. You could see the writing on the wall for guys like me. 53 years old, salaried, with a pension that actually mattered. Carl probably saw a dollar sign over my head every time I walked past. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed that loyalty had to count for something. That if I just kept my head down, kept producing, someone up the chain would notice. Maybe the CEO would remember how I'd saved our skin back in 2012 when the SEC came sniffing around. Maybe someone would speak up. No one did. Because in companies like that, the moment you stop being useful to someone's promotion, you're just ballast, something to toss overboard to keep the ship light enough to impress shareholders. So when Carl called me into his office and started talking about restructuring, I already knew what was coming. What caught me off guard wasn't that he fired me. It was how cleanly, how casually he did it. Like I was a defective part in an engine he was tuning up. No emotion, no hesitation, just another move in his game. What he didn't realize, what he never even thought to check, was that in the process of erasing me from the system, they left a few old doors unlocked. Outdated folders, legacy access paths, admin-level files tied to usernames no one had updated since the last IT migration. They stripped my badge, deleted my login, and patted themselves on the back for a clean break. But I had built the bones of that system. I was the damn system. I knew the back doors, the cache trails, the forgotten pathways buried under years of digital clutter. And buried deep inside all that one spreadsheet, the one with every dirty little financial trick Carl had played since the day he arrived. I had built it under the guise of internal compliance, a catch-all for internal transparency that no one ever really looked at, except me. And now I was outside the system, invisible, no longer a risk in their eyes. I wasn't mad. I wasn't even hurt. Not really. Not anymore. I was just patient. And patience, as Carl was about to learn, is what makes all the difference. It started as a late-night curiosity, if I'm being honest. I had just come back from what was supposed to be a relaxing dinner with my wife. She kept asking if I was all right, if maybe it was time to start thinking about what was next, maybe consulting or finally opening that shop I used to talk about when we were young and dumb enough to dream of things like coffee roasters or used bookstores. But all I could think about was Carl's smirk. That exact moment he told me I was no longer part of the vision, while pretending like he was doing me a favor. It had stuck with me, lingered like a bad aftertaste, and the more I thought about it, the more it festered. I wasn't angry when I left, not really, but sitting there in the dark, sipping on some 2-finger pour of scotch and staring at a blank TV screen, I felt something else brewing. Something colder. I still had my personal laptop, the old one I used to bring home when the company was still too cheap to issue work-from-home gear. When remote work first became a thing, I'd taken the liberty of syncing some files. Nothing sensitive at the time, just the usual budgets, planning docs, templates I didn't want to rebuild every quarter. No one had batted an eye because, honestly, I was the guy they wanted to be that thorough. The guy who could dig up an old invoice from 2014 in under 2 minutes flat. The company had always leaned on me for that kind of deep archive magic. So when I opened up my directories that night, just out of habit, I didn't expect much. I was half hoping it would help me let go, get some closure. But then I saw it. Tucked away in an old Cloud Sync folder I had mirrored back in the days before we switched over to a managed file system. Exec comp, master, final 2. XLs. At first, I hesitated. It was like bumping into an X by accident. Your stomach tightens, your heart stumbles a beat, and part of you wants to just close the tab and pretend you never saw it. But I opened it, and when I did, it all came flooding back. The color-coded tabs, the nested formulas I had spent nights refining, the notes and lookup sheets that only made sense to someone who had lived inside this system for as long as I had. There it was, clear as day, years' worth of executive compensation data, compiled from monthly reports, cross-referenced against payroll, expense claims, vendor payments, and consulting invoices. It was all there because no one else had the time or the patience to pull it together like I had. I did it under the guise of transparency, internal audits, compliance checks, all the corporate buzzwords that make people feel safe. Back then, we didn't have a clear view of who was getting what. The board loved to shuffle bonuses under vague performance incentives, and Carl had turned it into an art. When he first came in, his compensation was modest, on paper, at least. But over time, I noticed strange reimbursements. A $6,800 strategic dining invoice from a steakhouse in Miami. Problem was, we didn't have any events scheduled there that year. A quarterly bonus marked as discretionary leadership allocation, approved by an executive who, as it turned out, had just been awarded a contract to his brother's tech firm. Consultant fees paid out to a shell LLC that didn't exist on any public record before Carl's arrival. Every month, more red flags appeared. And like any good employee, I flagged them. Quietly. Internally. I sent emails. I asked questions. I was told, politely but firmly, to stop distracting from forward momentum. That was the language they used. Forward momentum. So I started keeping my own copy of the data, not because I was plotting anything, but because I knew the day might come when someone would ask the right question, and I wanted to have the right answer. Carl was careful, but he wasn't invisible. The file had grown slowly over time, layered with data, references, payment IDs, even screenshots of approval chains, in case someone ever tried to delete them. It was meant to be a safety net, but now, holding it in my hands again, it felt like a fuse. And Carl had left me the match. I spent that entire night going through the spreadsheet. I checked dates, verified data trails, recreated the paths I had once known by muscle memory. Some of the links were dead, file locations long since wiped, but the bulk of it was intact. Cross-referencing old payment records and internal memos, I could trace a pattern. Carl had been running his own quiet side game for at least 2 years, skimming from discretionary budgets, inflating travel reports, backdating invoices, and using shadow vendors to funnel out money without triggering red flags. It was all technically approved because he'd built a system where no one ever said no to him. And now, with a few screenshots and a little context, I had the kind of evidence that wouldn't just raise eyebrows. It would blow up the entire C-suite if it landed in the right inbox. But I wasn't ready yet. Revenge isn't something you do quickly. It's not a slap in the face. It's a cold wind that creeps up behind you when you think you're finally warm. And I wasn't going to waste this on a petty outburst. Carl had taken everything from me. My job, my pride, my sense of place, and he'd done it with a smirk, like I was some relic he'd swept out with the cobwebs. If I was going to hit back, it needed to count. Not just for me, but for every other poor bastard who had watched their career get eaten alive by some grinning, expense-padding executive who thought they were untouchable. So I backed up the spreadsheet to an external drive, encrypted the files, made copies, and stored them in 3 different places. Not because I thought anyone was watching, but because I'd seen what happens when digital evidence goes missing. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared. Carl didn't know I had it. No one did. That was my power. And now I waited. Because sometimes the most dangerous man in the building isn't the one with the corner office. It's the one you just locked outside. It's funny how once the anger cools, What remains is a quiet sort of clarity, the kind that doesn't roar, but whispers, deliberate and patient. After I rediscovered that spreadsheet, I didn't rage, I didn't scream into the void, and I sure as hell didn't send a company-wide email like some kind of keyboard vigilante. That's not how people like me operate. I'd spent decades learning how to hold a poker face in budget meetings where entire departments got trimmed like hedges. I'd sat in boardroom chairs across from men who thought ethics was just a buzzword HR used during onboarding. So when I realized what I had, I didn't rush. I settled in. Because revenge, if you're going to do it right, isn't a sprint. It's a siege. The first step was just observation. I kept tabs quietly from the outside. My buddy Greg in accounting, one of the last decent guys left in that building, had no idea what I was sitting on, but he liked to vent over coffee. We'd meet up every other Friday at this little diner just off I-94, and he'd give me the rundown, like a beat reporter delivering dispatches from the front lines. Apparently, after my departure, Carl had started tightening the screws even more. He was slashing budgets, reworking job titles to squeeze 2 roles out of 1 person, and leaning on performance metrics that didn't make any operational sense. Turnover was climbing, morale was shot, and the interns were being used like full-time staff without so much as a benefits package to soften the blow. I listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, and every so often I'd ask a question that seemed innocent. Did they ever replace me? Was anyone else touching the audit files I used to maintain? Were the vendor lists changing? Each answer confirmed what I suspected. Carl thought he'd successfully erased me from the company's institutional memory. My name had vanished from the internal wiki. My procedural manuals had been streamlined into vague bullet point checklists. Even my old projects had been stripped of attribution, repackaged, and sent up the chain with someone else's signature on the cover slide. That stung more than I expected, but it also confirmed something crucial. Carl thought the game was over, but the game was only just beginning. I started compiling a file, not a sloppy expose, not a rant, but a careful, methodical case. I pulled every relevant line from the spreadsheet, added context, cross-checked it with publicly available data, and then annotated it like a forensic accountant preparing for court. I didn't just want the numbers to speak, I wanted them to scream. The shell vendors had subtle tells, like similar invoice structures or identical grammar quirks in their proposal language. The reimbursements tied to non-existent events lined up with travel itineraries that made no geographical sense. And then there were the emails. Oh, the emails. I had saved a handful, forwarded to my personal account before the firewall got smart, and those digital receipts were like breadcrumbs in a forest Carl thought he had burned down. Once I had the evidence tight, I sent a small, anonymous packet to the one department Carl couldn't charm his way out of, the internal audit team. They were buried deep within corporate, underfunded and underappreciated, but they were meticulous. And more importantly, they were scared of scandal. I sent it to their generic inbox, using a throwaway email and an IP scrambler for good measure. No name, no threat, just a subject line that read, "You missed something." And in the body? A neatly formatted PDF with a few high-level anomalies and a short note suggesting they check expense reports from Q3 and Q4 of the previous year, along with vendor contract 7982KA, which tied directly to Carl's brother-in-law's fake consulting firm. Then I waited. At first, nothing changed. No news, no headlines, just more updates from Greg about how Carl was pushing for a new efficiency dashboard and whispering about taking over the COO role next fiscal year. That was fine. I hadn't expected fireworks, but then 2 weeks after my anonymous submission, Greg told me something interesting. There had been a sudden freeze on executive expenses, a halt on approvals that had been processed automatically for years. Apparently, a routine compliance audit had triggered it, but no one was talking. Carl was reportedly furious behind closed doors, snapping at assistants, holding impromptu meetings with legal, and, according to Greg, acting like a man who had just realized he'd stepped on a landmine and didn't know if or when it would go off. That was when I knew the ball was rolling. I didn't stop there. I waited another week, then dropped another packet. This time, to the company's outside compliance firm. I was careful, providing just enough breadcrumb data to make them curious, enough that they'd want to dig deeper without being able to ignore it. Their contract required them to report potential financial misconduct directly to the board. I knew the rules because I helped write them back when integrity still meant something around there. And then, as if on cue, the dominoes began to fall. Carl stopped appearing in internal newsletters. The company's quarterly town hall, normally a showcase for his smug summaries and future-facing jargon, was delayed without explanation. Legal started sending update your passwords memos to departments that hadn't seen IT involvement in years. And Greg? Greg stopped talking. At first I thought he was ghosting me, but then he texted me a single line. SHIT is happening. I can't talk. I didn't push. I didn't need to. I just sat back, sipping my coffee at that same diner, reading the headlines of local business journals, and waiting for the one I knew was coming. Because once people like Carl start slipping, they don't fall quietly. They crash, loudly, publicly. And the best part? They never see who pushed them. When the news finally broke, it didn't make the front page, nor did it lead any primetime news cycle. Instead, it slipped into the world like a quiet thunderclap, a story tucked neatly into the third section of the business journal, wedged between a mid-sized merger announcement and an article about projected logistics bottlenecks for Q3. The headline was subdued: Finance exec exits amid internal review. But I didn't need screaming fonts or bold letters to know exactly what it meant. Carl Bennett, chief financial officer of a company I had once called home for over 2 decades, had stepped down to pursue new opportunities. A euphemism we both knew translated to one thing: the noose had tightened, the jig was up, and someone in legal had finally reached the point where plausible deniability was no longer worth protecting him. The article was polite, sterilized, and clearly vetted by the company's PR department. It made no mention of the investigation. It didn't say anything about the vendors or the reimbursements or the strategic retreats that had no documented attendees. But it didn't have to. I could read the gaps between the lines like old friends. There was no photo of Carl, no glowing tribute, no quotes from the CEO about his immeasurable contributions. There was only a quiet exit and a note that the finance team was undergoing a strategic audit to ensure operational transparency. In the corporate world, that's as close to a public execution as you get. I didn't celebrate, not in any loud or extravagant way. I didn't pop champagne or post cryptic messages online or send a single message to anyone inside that building. Instead, I took my morning walk, the same route I'd been taking every day since being let go, and I noticed something different in my chest. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It wasn't even vindication, though there was a bitter note of satisfaction in there. What I felt was relief, the kind that doesn't hit you all at once, but instead settles in gradually, like the weight you've carried for so long finally realizing it can let go of your spine. For months, I had walked around with a storm sitting in my gut. Now, all that remained was stillness. Of course, the fallout didn't stop with Carl. From what Greg eventually told me, once the dust started to settle and he felt safe enough to meet me again, there were other consequences. A few middle managers who had signed off on Carl's expense approvals were quietly removed or reassigned. The head of procurement took early retirement, and a new compliance officer was brought in from outside the company, someone with a background in federal contracting and forensic auditing. Apparently, she had already begun reworking the entire internal controls framework, starting with vendor intake protocols and expense reimbursement thresholds. Greg called it a bloodletting, though he said it like someone watching a forest fire from the safety of a mountain. Uncomfortable, but necessary. What surprised me most was how quickly the company moved to erase the past. Within weeks of Carl's exit, his name was stripped from internal documentation. His team's reorg plan was scrapped entirely. Training materials with his branding were pulled from the learning system. The very man who had strutted through the office like a monarch in waiting, who had once dismissed me with a handful of buzzwords and a rehearsed apology, had vanished from the digital walls of the company like he'd never existed at all. His name became a ghost, referenced only in hushed tones and lessons learned conversations. And yet, even as justice, if you could call it that, played out, I didn't feel whole. I didn't get my job back. There was no apology. No one from HR reached out to say, "You were right, Tom." There was no retroactive acknowledgement of my work, no reinstatement of my reputation within those walls. I was still gone, still erased, still sitting on the outside of a place I had once given the best years of my life to. The company would survive, maybe even thrive under the new guard, and Carl would, in time, land on his feet somewhere else. Men like him always do. He'd change cities, update his resume, spin the story into a redemption arc about lessons learned and growth earned. Some other boardroom, some other set of shareholders would eventually hand him another chance. That's how the system works. I didn't do what I did to destroy him. I didn't want a public trial or some drawn-out scandal. I just wanted the truth to matter. I wanted someone to see what I saw, to understand that people like Carl don't just bend the rules. They write new ones that only benefit themselves. I wanted the rot to be exposed, and more than that, I wanted to feel like I hadn't gone crazy, like those late nights and those ignored emails and those polite dismissals of my concerns weren't just me being difficult. I wanted proof that my instincts hadn't failed me. In that sense, I got what I wanted. Eventually, Greg asked me if I'd consider coming back, now that the dust had cleared and the top brass had changed. He said there was a role being quietly created that would suit my experience. Internal audit advisor, part-time, high trust, no direct reports. He said people missed the stability I brought, the way I made things run when everything else was chaos. I told him I'd think about it. I haven't answered yet. Some nights I lean toward yes. Some mornings I lean hard toward no. Because the truth is, the company that I gave 23 years to is not the same place I walked out of that day. Something cracked in me the moment I handed over my badge, something that doesn't mend just because the villain got caught. I learned that no matter how much loyalty you pour into a place, it doesn't always come back to you. And I learned that sometimes the only way to keep your dignity is to walk away and never look back. But every now and then, I open that spreadsheet, not to gloat, not to stir the past, but to remind myself that I wasn't crazy and that I didn't imagine it. I kept the file, archived, encrypted, tucked away, because sometimes memory needs evidence, not for court, not for closure, but for clarity. Some people call it revenge. I call it balance.